Welcome, first-year history students, to this explainer. Today, we're setting the stage for your reading. Think of this as your pre-reading roadmap for the First World War. Now, we aren't here to replace your reading, and we're definitely not going to just list off facts one by one. Nope. Instead, we want to help you read way more effectively by pointing out the big picture patterns. So rather than slogging through the chapter page by page, we're organizing things into four main buckets: the illusion of neutrality, the expanding state, the war on dissent, idealism collides with reality, and finally, those big ideas to remember. Okay, part one, the illusion of neutrality, economic realities. One of the absolute most important ideas you're going to come across in this chapter is that American neutrality from 1914 to 1917, well, it was a whole lot more complicated than just staying out of the trenches. You see, when the conflict blew up in Europe, President Wilson famously asked Americans to be impartial in thought and action. He knew the U.S. was a nation of immigrants, many with deep ties to the warring nations, and honestly, he was terrified of internal conflict. But as you'll see in the text, economic realities made true neutrality practically impossible. So we really have to ask ourselves, was America actually neutral? Well, the numbers kind of speak for themselves here. We're talking about massive loans and a staggering 400% explosion in trade with the Allies. I mean, this essentially turned America into a giant warehouse for the Allied forces, completely forcing our hand economically. Just to put that into perspective, trade with the Allies skyrocketed to $3.2 billion, while trade with the Central Powers, it plummeted to almost zero, mostly thanks to the British naval blockade. The American economy was absolutely booming, but only because it was the main supplier for the Allies. And this matters big time. Why? Because Great Britain actually went and redefined what contraband meant. Traditionally, contraband just meant military gear, weapons, ammo, that sort of thing. But the British decided to include civilian food to literally starve Germany out. The result? Immense suffering. This prompted Germany to retaliate with unrestricted submarine warfare, using U-boats to sink ships, including the Lusitania. This led to tragic American deaths and massive public outrage, perfectly showing how our economic ties dragged us right to the brink of war. Moving on to part two, the expanding state, domestic mobilization. So, when the U.S. finally enters the war in 1917, they suddenly have to build an army of 5 million men. Think about that for a second. Now, a really common misconception is that the U.S. economy has just always been this strictly free market system. But this war, it required totally abandoning those laissez-faire, hands-off precepts. To equip and feed millions of soldiers, the federal government had to step in with unprecedented regulatory powers. They took control of the economy in a way that had literally never been seen before in American history. As you're doing the reading, definitely pay attention to these massive new federal agencies. Take Herbert Hoover's Food Administration, for example, which centralized immense power to mobilize the nation's food resources. Then you had the Selective Service Act drafting millions of young men and the War Industries Board directing factory production. I mean, the government even took over the entire railroad system. Could you imagine something like that happening today? It was a total game changer. Okay, let's take a look at this absolutely staggering number. $35 billion. That was the total cost of the war. It was an astronomical sum, especially back then. To pay this massive bill, the government was forced to aggressively raise taxes and push what they called Liberty loans. It got to the point where if you didn't buy a Liberty bond to help foot the bill, your very loyalty as an American was actively questioned. Your patriotism was tied directly to funding the state. And you know, that intense public pressure leads us right into our next historical pattern. Which brings us to part three, the war on dissent, crushing civil liberties. So when a nation completely mobilizes for total war, what actually happens to the freedom of its citizens back home? Well, notice how these events connect. The desperate need to unify a diverse nation of immigrants behind the war effort directly caused a ruthless campaign against anyone deemed not, quote-unquote, 100% American. President Wilson himself argued that dissenters were a threat, pouring poison into the nation, and that they had to be completely crushed out. German Americans faced intense, severe discrimination, and practically any criticism of the war was instantly treated as treason. This sequence of events perfectly shows continuity and change over time. What started as somewhat legitimate fears of German sabotage quickly morphed, it snowballed until the Supreme Court was actually justifying major restrictions on free speech under the clear and present danger standard. The Espionage and Sedition Acts effectively criminalized anti-war speech. And this wartime paranoia, It didn't just magically disappear when the fighting stopped. It transitioned directly into the post-war Red Scare and the Palmer Raids, where the government actively hunted down suspected radicals and anarchists. Take socialist leader Eugene V. Debs as a prime example of the author's larger argument here. Debs merely gave a speech pointing out that the working class fought the battles while the so-called master class declared the wars. And for that, he was sentenced to 10 years in federal prison. 10 years! It really goes to show exactly how far the government was willing to stretch its power to enforce ideological unity. Moving into part 4, idealism collides with reality, the broken peace. Now shifting back overseas to look at the ideological justifications for the war. You really want to see the historical cause and effect at play here. When communist revolutionaries took over Russia, they published all these secret documents exposing the fact that the Allies were really just fighting to grab land and resources. It was a PR nightmare. Wilson had to pivot, and fast, to convince the world this was actually a noble war for democracy. And that scramble for the moral high ground resulted in his famous 14 points. Now, what's really fascinating about this concept of self-determination is that Wilson heavily championed it. He raised the hopes of colonized peoples all over the globe. Self-determination sounded absolutely incredible to people living under imperial rule in places like Africa and Asia. The idea that you can only be governed by your own consent? Amazing. But it was absolutely despised by his own allies. The British and French had massive global empires, and they had exactly zero intention of giving them up. So the crucial point to take away is this stark comparison. Wilson's grand idealism completely slammed into a brick wall. The vengeful reality of British and French leaders who simply wanted to punish Germany and expand their own empires. The Treaty of Versailles ended up being drafted in secret. It certainly didn't grant self-determination. It just handed German colonies right over to the victors. And instead of forging a fair peace, it forced Germany to accept all the blame for the war and pay massive, crippling reparations. The historical significance of this cannot be overstated. The blatant hypocrisy of the Treaty of Versailles didn't just devastate Germany. It literally planted the seeds for massive future global conflicts, like World War II and the Vietnam War. Young leaders from colonized nations actually attended the peace conference, fully expecting Wilson to make good on his promises of self-determination. But when they were brushed aside and ignored, they turned their backs on Western democracy and started looking toward radical alternatives, like communism. And finally, part 5, big ideas to remember. Let's wrap this explainer up by summarizing the overarching framework. I highly recommend you write down these 4 big ideas. Recognizing these patterns of cause, effect, and contradiction is exactly what a college-level history student needs to be doing with the text. First, remember that economics and trade forced America's entry into the war. Second, fighting that war required the federal government to massively expand its control over the economy. Third, that mobilization and demand for total unity crushed civil liberties at home. And fourth, the Treaty of Versailles completely failed to live up to Wilson's democratic ideals. Keep this provocative question in the back of your mind as you do your reading. When a nation goes to war, can it truly protect its interests abroad without destroying its liberties at home? It's a tough one, right? Think about how the legacy of the First World War still shapes our government and global conflicts today. Use this roadmap to connect the specific facts, dates, and people in your textbook to these larger, fascinating historical shifts. Happy reading!